The sky had opened before dawn, spilling rain like a confession over the red clay roads of Moaza village. Fat drops pattered against rusted zinc rooftops, mixing with the smoke of early morning cooking fires and the faint scent of burning cassava. The earth, wet and stubborn beneath bare feet, clung to ankles and heels like it didn't want to let anyone go. Chickens darted under makeshift shelters. Water trickled through trenches carved by years of storms, weaving through potholes and the twisted roots of ancient baobab trees. Overhead, the clouds hung heavy and gray, swallowing the early sun and casting the village in a moody kind of light, the kind that made everything feel older, more tired. Down the narrow, uneven lane that split the heart of Moaza, a figure moved slowly, deliberately, holding an old leather satchel close to his chest. His name was Kwame, a schoolteacher, though few ever used the title with any real respect. His coat was threadbare, sleeves fraying at the cuffs, and his sandals had long since stopped keeping out the wet. Still, every morning he walked the same path, rain or shine, to the one-room schoolhouse near the outskirts of the village, a place where the roof leaked, the desks wobbled, and the chalk was always in short supply. He never complained, not about the long walk, nor the empty stomach he often carried into the classroom, nor the way people sometimes looked through him like a smudge on a window. Kwame had eyes that told stories even when his mouth stayed quiet. Eyes dark like coffee beans, rimmed with quiet sadness, and filled with a patience most could not understand. His hands, rough, cracked, permanently stained with ink and chalk dust, bore the marks of someone who had built his life around giving, giving without being asked, giving without ever expecting to be remembered. Children would pass him on the road and barely nod, their parents calling him the poor teacher, in tones too loud to be polite and too careless to hide. Some laughed when he bought bruised bananas or begged old textbooks from market stalls. Their smiles twisted, never cruel, but never kind either. Yet, each morning, he arrived early at the schoolhouse, lighting a small fire to warm the space, wiping the windows clean even though the rain would mark them again in minutes. He taught by candlelight when the sun refused to rise, and read from torn pages with such reverence, it made even the poorest words feel like gold. Most days, he had only boiled maize for lunch, and even that he would split if a student arrived hungry, which in Moaza was more common than not. On one particular morning, as the storm thundered overhead and small rivers formed across the classroom floor, a boy with sunken cheeks and shoes made of twine slipped through the doorway. His eyes were sharp, despite the hunger. He carried no books, only silence and the smell of wet earth. Kwame looked up from his notes, met the boy's gaze, and nodded toward a dry spot near the back. No questions, no demand for payment, just a gesture, small but profound. Later, as the boy devoured a dry piece of bread Kwame had saved from the night before, someone passed by the window, a woman with a basket of mangoes, and muttered under her breath, "Feeding strays again, eh, poor Kwame?" The words hung in the humid air like smoke, curling into the cracks of the school walls. Kwame didn't flinch, but the boy looked up. He had heard. There was no anger in his eyes, only something quieter, deeper, something that would not be forgotten. Years passed like the slow winding of the river that cut through the edge of Moaza, and still Kwame taught. Seasons came and went, bringing floods and droughts, good harvests and bitter lean months. The village changed in small, quiet ways. Roofs replaced with tin, a new borehole installed after years of petitions, a tiny medical outpost built from donations. But some things remained untouched. The schoolhouse still stood with its leaning walls, still filled with children who came and went, most never staying long enough to remember multiplication tables or spelling lessons. Hunger, illness, and chores always dragged them back into the world before learning could lift them out. But one boy stayed. His name was Jabari. the same boy who had come in from the rain with eyes full of silence and ribs peeking through his shirt. He came every day now, arriving even before Kwame, sweeping the floors without being asked, lighting the small cooking fire, fetching water in a yellow jerry can almost as big as his body. He listened with a hunger that went beyond food, scribbling notes furiously with broken pencils, memorizing every word Kwame spoke like scripture. At first, the villagers laughed. "That orphan again?" they'd scoff. "Kwame's little shadow. Maybe he's hoping for inheritance, though there's nothing to inherit but a life of suffering." But the joke slowly faded as they watched Jabari rise. He began answering questions others couldn't. He stopped just copying lessons and started questioning them. "Why is it like this, teacher?" he'd ask, head tilted, brows furrowed. "Why do some children go to better schools in the city? Why don't we have enough books? Why is there always more for some and never for others?" Kwame never brushed him off. Instead, he smiled, the deep kind of smile that came from pain and hope living side by side, and said, "Because some children are meant to ask why, and one day you'll give us better answers." Kwame had very little to offer, but what he did give, he gave without holding back. He gave Jabari his old radio when the boy expressed interest in English broadcasts. "It's broken," he warned, "but maybe you can fix it." And Jabari did. After 2 weeks, it crackled to life, filling the air with BBC World Service and stories from lands beyond Moaza. Kwame gave him a tattered atlas with half the pages missing and watched Jabari pore over it for hours, tracing the names of countries with a calloused finger, repeating them aloud like sacred verses. Kenya, Ghana, Brazil, Japan, Canada. "One day," he whispered, "one day, I'll see these places, teacher." Kwame chuckled, but not mockingly. "Then promise me you'll send me a postcard from each one." One particularly harsh season brought devastation. The rains failed, crops shriveled in the soil. Children stopped coming to school, sent instead to fetch water or hawk fruit at the roadside. Kwame himself began walking longer distances just to find cassava flour. His body thinned, but he never missed a day in class. Jabari noticed. He began sharing his own food with Kwame, hiding roasted groundnuts in his pocket, placing small balls of kenki on the teacher's desk when he thought he wouldn't see. Kwame saw, always, and said nothing. There was no need for thanks between them anymore. What bound them was stronger than charity. It was love, quiet and determined. At night, when the oil lamp burned low, Jabari studied until his eyes could no longer stay open. He wrote letters to imaginary universities, crafted essays about his dreams, and kept them all in a shoebox under his mat. He knew no one would read them yet, but still he wrote. It was Kwame who eventually found a scholarship notice buried in a stack of newspapers donated to the school. It was for a science competition held in the capital. Jabari's eyes lit up like someone had turned the sun inside him. He worked on his project, an idea about converting animal waste into cooking gas using makeshift materials. He built it from plastic bottles, old tubing, and manure from his neighbor's goats. On the day of the competition, Kwame sold his only wristwatch to pay for Jabari's transport. "It's just a watch," he said gently when Jabari protested. "But you're time itself." Go Jabari went. He stood in a hall filled with students in polished shoes and pressed uniforms. His project looked crude beside theirs, but when he spoke, everything else faded. He spoke of Moaza, of hunger, of the smell of burning wood smoke, of how his invention could help. He spoke like someone who had lived the problem, not just studied it. And the judges listened. He won. Not just the competition, but the attention of a woman from an NGO who saw in his eyes something unteachable: fire and purpose. She helped him apply for a full scholarship abroad. He was just 16. When the letter arrived, an envelope thick with stamps and hope, Kwame sat with it for a long time before calling Jabari. He wanted to savor the moment. Jabari opened it with shaking hands, eyes racing across the page, then stopping. He couldn't speak. He only hugged Kwame so tightly that the old man's bones ached. "They want me," he finally whispered. "They want me in Canada." The days that followed were bittersweet. The village was divided, some proud, others jealous, most simply confused. "That orphan?" they murmured. "In Canada? They must be mad." But Kwame stood tall, his back straighter than it had been in years. He helped Jabari prepare, taught him how to write formal letters, to iron a shirt, to shake hands firmly. On the morning Jabari was to leave, the whole school gathered under the neem tree outside the classroom. Kwame stood before them, holding an old envelope. Inside was a note he had written long ago, folded and refolded until the edges were soft. He handed it to Jabari. "Open it when you're far enough away that Moaza is just a memory, but close enough that you can still hear its heartbeat." Jabari boarded the bus, his belongings in one worn suitcase, and a heart so full it nearly burst. From the window, he waved until the village vanished into the haze. And when the road curved around the hills and the bus climbed toward the wider world, he finally opened the letter. It said only this: "Never forget the soil that grew you. Even gold comes from dirt." In the years that followed, Jabari studied like a man possessed. He sent postcards from Montreal, from Nairobi, from Singapore. He studied engineering, then business, and finally started his own company. First small, solar panels for rural homes, then bigger, with funding and investors who saw that same light Kwame had seen. He created clean energy systems for developing nations. His name began to appear in headlines, then on magazine covers, then on the tongues of presidents and policymakers. But he never forgot. Every year, without fail, a package would arrive at Moaza school. Books, supplies, a new water tank, then came computers, then a scholarship fund. But never a return address, only the initials, J.K. It had been nearly 10 years since Jabari last saw the sun rise over the cracked walls of Moaza's schoolhouse. Time had stretched and folded in strange ways. Cities blurred into each other, languages mixed in his ears, and the air always smelled of glass and ambition. He wore tailored suits now. His voice commanded boardrooms. His name appeared in Forbes and on donor walls of hospitals he helped build. But in the quiet moments, those rare, still seconds between flights and meetings, his mind wandered back to a pair of calloused hands setting chalk to a board, to a voice patient as rain, and to the warmth of a piece of bread offered without conditions. He had built an empire, but the foundation of it was laid in the red dirt of Moaza by a man who asked for nothing in return. The news reached him quietly, almost by accident. A letter forwarded by an old contact, written in fading ink, with clumsy handwriting, but heavy words. Kwame was unwell. The body that once walked 5 miles to school each day had given way to age and illness. He no longer taught. Some said he barely spoke. The village nurse mentioned his memory slipped sometimes, that he would sit outside the old schoolhouse in the afternoons, eyes scanning the horizon like he was waiting for someone to return. Jabari didn't wait. He canceled a speaking engagement in London, booked a flight under his mother's surname to avoid attention, and made his way back, not with press or security, but alone, as simply as he had once left. When he arrived, the village looked smaller. The baobab trees had grown, but the roads were the same, muddy, stubborn, honest. Children ran past him without a second glance, just as he once had. The old marketplace still smelled of frying plantain and dust, though now there were tin roofs where thatch had once been. He passed the school, rebuilt now with smooth walls, and a plaque that bore his initials, though he had never allowed his full name to be carved there. But it wasn't the school he came for. It was the house beyond the cassava fields, Kwame's house, a crumbling structure of faded mud bricks and rusted zinc. He knocked gently, heart thudding like it had when he opened that scholarship letter. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. The man who stood there was smaller than he remembered. Kwame's frame had thinned, his beard now a river of gray, eyes sunken but still deep. He squinted, confused at first. Then he smiled faintly. "Are you here for donations?" he asked, voice raspy, uncertain. Jabari felt his throat tighten. He stepped forward slowly and took Kwame's hands in his. "No, teacher," he said softly. "I came for you." The old man blinked, and something shimmered in his eyes. A pause, then, "Jabari?" he whispered, barely daring to believe it. They sat for hours, no longer teacher and student, but something more sacred, two souls tethered by gratitude and love. Jabari told him everything: the company, the travels, the solar farms lighting up villages like Moaza. And Kwame listened, nodding slowly, often closing his eyes as if storing the words deep within, like seeds. Jabari pulled out something from his coat, a black box, simple, no gold or glitter. Inside, a medal from the United Nations, engraved with Jabari's name and the words, "For service to humanity." He placed it in Kwame's lap. "This is yours," he said. "It always was." The old man's hands trembled as he touched it, tears rolling down cheeks weathered by years of giving. "I have nothing to give you in return," he murmured. Jabari shook his head gently, his own eyes wet. "You already gave me the world." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of tangerine and ember, Jabari rose and walked to the schoolhouse with Kwame leaning on his shoulder. Children gathered, curious. Some recognized Jabari from newspaper clippings on the classroom wall. Others only saw a rich man helping an old one walk. But Kwame's gaze held them all. "This," he said, his voice a little stronger now, "this is what becomes of kindness, of never giving up. This is what every child can become, if someone just believes in them." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Mothers wiped their eyes. Fathers stood taller. And in the glow of that moment, something shifted in the village, like a door opening where there had only been walls. That night, Jabari stayed in Kwame's home, not a hotel, not a guest house, but beside the very man who had once offered him half a meal and a full heart. They ate boiled yams and laughed over memories, the years melting between them like morning mist. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of Moaza changed, not with noise or spectacle, but with quiet, deliberate transformations that only hearts could measure. Jabari didn't come back to visit. He came back to stay, at least for a while, not as a guest of honor, but as a son of the soil returning to tend the roots that once nurtured him. He walked barefoot again on the red earth, greeted elders with bowed head and respect, listened to women's voices in the market, and played football with barefoot boys whose laughter rang through the same dusty lanes where he once walked alone. But more than presence, he brought purpose. The once failing clinic was repaired within days of his return. Medicine stocked, solar panels installed, a full-time nurse hired from the nearby city. A borehole was dug deeper than any before, and suddenly, water flowed freely in Moaza, clean and cold. Children no longer missed school to walk miles in search of it. And the school, Kwame's old school, became the heart of everything. With Jabari's quiet guidance and deep funding, it was transformed into a model academy. Classrooms received desks with their names carved proudly into the wood, donated in honor of teacher Kwame. New teachers arrived, trained and passionate, inspired by the legend of the man who had once taught with no salary, no resources, and no hesitation. A library was built, its walls painted with murals of African leaders, scientists, inventors, and in one corner, a simple portrait of Kwame, drawn from memory by a local boy. Eyes soft, hands raised, chalk in one, hope in the other. Every morning, students gathered in a small assembly beneath the neem tree. They sang, they recited, and always, always, they said one line together, the words Jabari had once read from that folded letter. "Never forget the soil that grew you." Kwame, though his body weakened with each passing day, seemed to bloom under the warmth of this rebirth. He no longer sat outside waiting for the past to return. It had come, but not in the way he expected. It had returned transformed, shining, alive. Children he had once taught, long since grown and scattered, came back with offerings of thanks. A bag of rice, a woven mat, a simple poem, and they all brought stories. "You made me believe I was more than my hunger," one man whispered. "You taught me how to count when I had nothing," said another. Kwame only smiled, sometimes too tired to speak, his hands resting on his lap like folded wings. Jabari visited him every day, sitting quietly at his side, sometimes reading aloud from old books, sometimes just watching the light move across the walls of the house. One day, as dusk painted the sky in gold, Kwame took Jabari's hand and held it gently. "You were always going to rise," he said, voice thin but firm. "All I did was remind you that you could." Jabari nodded, the weight of everything they'd shared pressing gently on his chest like an anchor of gratitude. "You reminded me I mattered," he replied. "That was all I ever needed." Not long after, one cool morning, when the mist curled like breath over the fields, Kwame passed peacefully in his sleep. He was found with a faint smile on his lips, the medal from the United Nations still resting beside his bed. The entire village mourned him, but it was a mourning filled not only with sadness, but reverence. His funeral was simple, as he would have wanted, but powerful. Children sang songs he had taught them. Mothers carried flowers from their gardens. Jabari spoke only a few words. "He planted me in love, and I grew into what he believed I could become." As they laid him to rest beneath the shade of the great baobab, just beside the school, the wind picked up softly, rustling through the trees like a whispered blessing. And in that moment, it felt as if the village itself bowed in respect, not just to a man who had fed an orphan, but to the quiet miracle of compassion that had turned that orphan into a beacon for the world. Years passed again, but differently this time. Not as burdens, but as blessings. Moaza, once a forgotten dot on the map, now pulsed with life and pride. Journalists occasionally came, drawn by the improbable story of the orphan turned billionaire and the poor village teacher who changed his life. But Jabari rarely spoke to them. He gave no grand interviews, no self-congratulatory speeches. "This story is not about me," he'd say. "It's about what happens when someone chooses to believe in a person the world forgot." Instead, he focused on building legacies that would outlive cameras and headlines. He launched the Sakwame Foundation. Its mission simple but bold: to find gifted children in remote places and give them not just education, but belief. Books and laptops? Yes, but also mentors and meals, love and structure, hope and presence. Every school they built bore a quote from Kwame painted above the entrance. "Even gold comes from dirt." Every year on the anniversary of Kwame's passing, Jabari returned to Moaza, always quietly, always without an entourage. He'd visit the baobab, where the teacher lay, clearing the weeds with his own hands, placing fresh marigolds at the foot of the simple stone marked only with the words, "Teacher, Beloved." He'd sit for hours, sometimes speaking, sometimes listening, as though Kwame still sat across from him, still ready to offer quiet wisdom between sips of lukewarm tea. The villagers came to know this ritual and never disturbed it. Children, now proud and curious, were told the story every year by their elders. How one man's kindness had echoed into generations, how one piece of bread became an empire of light, and Jabari, though known in cities and celebrated in nations, never stopped being that boy who swept classroom floors and memorized lessons by lamplight. Success had never hardened him. Instead, it softened him in all the right ways. He still remembered the way hunger felt. He still noticed the silence behind children's eyes. And when he spoke in gatherings of power, before leaders and kings, he never forgot to mention a name that made the room fall quiet: Kwame. He spoke of the way the old man gave without expecting, the way he taught not for pay, but for purpose, the way he loved without needing to say it aloud. And always, always, he ended with a challenge. Find your own kwame, he'd say, or better still, be one. One day, long after the story had become legend, Jabari sat under the neem tree with a small boy beside him, his own son, barely 7. The boy held a book in his lap and asked, "Is it true, Papa, that you were once so poor you didn't have shoes?" Jabari smiled, nodding. Not just shoes, sometimes not even food. The boy looked confused. But how did you become this? Jabari's eyes grew distant for a moment, drifting back to a rainy morning, to a classroom of dust and dreams, to a teacher's quiet eyes. "Because someone saw me," he said. "Someone fed me when they had little. Someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." The boy nodded, as if memorizing each word. "I want to be like him." Jabari's smile deepened. "Then you'll change the world." And so the story lived on. Not just in memory, not just in buildings or charities, but in spirit. In the child who stayed late at school to help clean, in the teacher who paid for chalk with their last coin, in the stranger who offered food without asking for a name. The village remembered. The world remembered. Because once, in a forgotten corner of Africa, a poor village teacher gave a hungry boy his last piece of bread, and unknowingly fed the future.